With February being the month of romance, I wanted to explore one of the most fascinating literary couples of all time, F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. Their love story, filled with passion, creativity, and turbulence, has captivated us for generations. This year is especially significant because it is the 100th anniversary of The Great Gatsby, a novel that remains one of the most celebrated works in American literature. Behind every great writer is a story, and Scott's was inextricably linked to Zelda, a brilliant writer and artist in her own right. Together, they shaped a legacy that continues to inspire. To help us explore their story, I am joined today by Alaina Doten, Executive Director of the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum. We discuss the fascinating dynamic between the two, the creative challenges they faced, and why their work continues to resonate all these years later. Plus, we take a look at the museum's efforts to preserve not just their physical space, but the spirit of their artistic contributions. Whether you are a longtime Fitzgerald fan or just love a good romance, let's step into the world of Scott and Zelda. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host and the founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma's silver. Well, Alaina, I'm very excited to sit down and chat with you today. I think with February, Valentine's Day is on everyone's mind, and I, as a reader, am always drawn to literary romance this time of the year. So I thought no better time to sit down and talk with someone from the Fitzgerald Museum. So I just want to turn this over to you for a moment and give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, the museum, share the mission, just tell folks what you're all about.
Yeah, we're the Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald Museum, and we're in Alabama. We're in Zelda's hometown, not Scott's. And we are the only museum dedicated to the two of them. It's a historic home in a historic neighborhood. And basically, our mission is to want to preserve their memories and legacies, but also it's part of our mission to help try and foster the next Scott and Zelda. So, both in literature, but fine arts. It's interesting how many people you would think they would know Scott because of The Great Gatsby, and they probably read it in high school. But even though I'm from Montgomery and my grandmother had ties to Zelda's family, grew up in the same neighborhood and knew her, it's amazing to me how many people come from around the world for Zelda. The people that come to the museum, our demographics are really varied because you think, well, it's just these two people. Some people come for Gatsby, some people come for Scott's. They're huge Fitzgerald fans, so they love his short stories. But I would say the second largest group after Gatsby is fans of their letters. Some people don't know, but there's the book Dear Scott, Dear Zelda, which is a collection of their letters to each other, and they're quite beautiful. And it spans from when they met here in 1918 all the way until Scott's death in 1940. I guess as a historian, I'm not a literature person, I'm an historian, but it was a little surprising to me that that is a lot of people's favorites. So if your listeners if they haven't read them already, I highly recommend them. And they're
Okay.
easy to read. And you can see how the other thing is Zelda, there's a lot of myths around Zelda. Did Scott plagiarize her? Not. I do not believe that he did. I don't think there's any evidence he did. But I think what does actually give credence to it and kind of, I don't know, I enjoy the fact that it lives her there and lives her in both of their esteems as a writer is that you see how beautifully she writes just in her letters. So I think they were both very good writers. I think he ultimately was the better writer. But to see two people at that level and quite passionate in their young life. But I just think that's something that we've lost, the love letter.
You hit on something important, which is location. And I do want to
Mhm.
just kind of talk about that for a minute because I believe you said you're located in Montgomery, Alabama. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's
So
Zelda's hometown.
how did that, and I have very limited knowledge of their backgrounds, so bear
Yeah.
with me here, but how did they end up meeting
He is from St.
Montgomery.
Paul, Minnesota. He went to boarding school at Newman, which is a very prominent prep school in New Jersey, and then to Princeton. And then most of his classmates at Princeton withdrew and entered the war. So he was stationed in Montgomery in 1918, and they met at a dance here in the neighborhood. It was then called the Montgomery Country Club. It was very rustic. It's in no way what we think of country clubs today. It was basically a golf club. When you
Okay.
see images of it, you think, what? For Fitzgerald fans, if they read the story The Jelly Bean, there's a very interesting description. It's considered one of the pre-Gatsby stories, but it's how this guy meets this girl outside in the parking lot outside this country club. It's very similar to Scott and Zelda's story. But he was stationed here in 1918. Montgomery at that time had about 40,000 people. Montgomery was very interesting during that time period because it was a technological hub. I don't think most people think of Montgomery civil rights, and that's probably our major tourism today. But Montgomery at the turn of the century, after the first flight at Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers established one of their flight schools here, and we still have the Air War College here. Montgomery also had the first electric streetcars called the Lightning Route and kind of the first electric street lights. So you had the population was about 40,000 people, and you had about 40,000 troops. A lot of young men, a lot of dances. And so when they talk about, they were always, you read Zelda in the letters, they're constantly at these dances. You're like, how many dances did they have? Almost every night. I mean, literally,
Wow.
you think that time period is very, like the term today is demure, whatnot. A lot of these evenings didn't start till 9, didn't end till well after midnight. I mean, they really lived it up. So that was the atmosphere that they met in here in Montgomery. He was a young officer.
Sorry, did you mention around the time period that we're talking
Yeah,
about?
around 1918.
18.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was stationed here.
Okay.
She had just graduated high school in 1918. Zelda's father was a state Supreme Court judge here. But what is not very well known about Zelda's family is that her mother was quite bohemian and her sisters as well. They were very, I don't like to use contemporary terms because, the political atmosphere, but her mother, Zelda's maternal grandfather, was a senator from Kentucky and ran for president. And her mother wanted to be an actress and had been offered a part by the Barrymores in Philadelphia, the great acting family. And you couldn't have an actor in the family, it was just scandalous. So she was forced to publicly recant that she had interest in the stage. And her father sent her, Zelda's mother, was sent to Montgomery for finishing school, and that's how she met her father. That's how Zelda's parents met here in Montgomery. And then in Montgomery, she founded a music and literary society, which was very unusual in that it had both men and women in it. Zelda's parents were Episcopal, but in the group, you had Catholics, Jews, and Episcopals around 1900. It was very unusual. In fact, a very prominent rabbi was in that group, Rabbi Messing, who later went to Chicago and was a civil rights leader. So people think Zelda was this rebel and this uptight. They just assume they're from Alabama, they're white, it's post Civil War. She's this rebel in this wild family. But Zelda was the baby of very her mother and her older sisters were also writers. Her Rosalind was a writer, did the society page, went up to the larger market of Birmingham, Alabama, and when they would not let her be a journalist beyond the society page, she quit and became the first. She quit, came back to Montgomery, and was the first woman to work at the bank. And she had to wear a veil because people would line up to see her. So I think
Wow.
Rosalind's 9 years older, 9 or 11 years older. So Zelda wasn't just this rebel in this uptight family. She was kind of catching up with her mother and her sisters. So she was this kind of wild, free spirit here. And I think that's in part what Scott probably fell in love with.
That's so interesting. And, one of the other things that I kind of would love to talk about in a broader context, and I think before we can really do that, is to just, if you're willing and able to
Yeah,
provide a
sure.
bit of history to, or background to, is their creative careers.
Okay.
did it, you're talking about Zelda being a writer, as much as she could be.
Mhm.
And we obviously know F. Scott was a writer. So how is that something that drew them together and then ultimately that they wanted to do professionally? Like, how did this evolve for them in their lives?
So he was wanted to be a writer from a young age. He was at Princeton. He was part of the Triangle Club and various writing societies. We have a lot of his Princeton. We have his Princeton yearbooks. Going back to his military service, we have his certificate of recognition. So almost all, it's the last war where the elites go to war, and almost his entire class at Princeton enlisted. And so, in lieu of diploma, they were given the certificate of recognition. And what's fascinating is we have his yearbooks. We looked up almost all his classmates, and without exception, one of two things happened. They either went on to greatness or they perished in the war. Over half perished in the war. So he was a part of a very interesting literary group. He's mainly remembered with Hemingway today, but a number of his classmates were poets, writers, editors. Edmund Wilson, one of his close friends, was the editor of Vanity Fair, which is important later, both for Scott and Zelda. So when Scott was stationed here in Montgomery, he finished the first draft of his first novel, This Side of Paradise. And then he was on the cusp of, well, his ship was deployed and it was forced to turn back because of Spanish flu. And then he was never redeployed because the armistice was called in November of 1918. And immediately after the war, he worked for an advertising agency in New York, but could hardly support himself. And he and Zelda had been engaged, but I think people think that she wouldn't marry him because he didn't have any money, but he couldn't support himself, and the options for women in that time were very limited. So he went home. He had submitted his first novel. They liked it, but said, make changes. He did that, resubmitted it. It was published, and it was an overnight success. I mean, it had to be reprinted in less than the first month. It
Wow.
went on to, I think, oh, I don't know the exact numbers, but I think it was in this like 15th printing. It came out in end of March, and it was in this like 18th printing by August. In the second edition, it's the rare case the second edition is sometimes more valuable than the original first edition, because in the second, to the booksellers, they put this plate in, and we have one here at the museum. It's called The Author's Apology. And he has this kind of very tongue-in-cheek apology for being so successful. But in it, he says he can sum up his whole theory of writing in one sentence, that an author ought to write for the youth of his own generation, the critics of the next, and the schoolmasters of ever afterward. So his novel comes out in the spring of 20, March of 20. It's this hit. Zelda gets on a train, goes to New York, and they are married at St. Patrick's Cathedral in April of 1920. Her sisters were there, her parents were not. And they just become these overnight sensations, the two of them. Um, I don't think students kind of laugh, but I don't even think when you like think Kim and Kanye or Beyonce and Jay-Z, they're not as famous today as they were back then. They were one of the first mass media couples. And so one of the things when his second novel came out, The Beautiful and Damned, and the cover even the cover art was drawn to even look like the two of them. Zelda wrote this very tongue-in-cheek review, which was published in one of the New York papers, and she says, "Oh, I think I recognize my diary. Plagiarism begins at home." And this is where scholars will say, "See, he plagiarized her," but it's not. What it was like in 1920, he had the top novel in the nation. He had the top six stories in the Saturday Evening Post. The Saturday Evening Post then, I think, had 14 million households. I mean, you would like 14 million households today. Households.
Mhm.
We forget there really aren't movies yet. There's no radio plays yet. So it would be like having the top seven, the top TV show, the top movie blockbuster,
Mhm.
everything. You don't know. I mean, there's not a hotter streak than he had in 1920. And so in the middle of this, he elevates her as a writer. Now, I'm a Zelda scholar. I will fight for Zelda, but I don't think that he gets credit for how he did try to elevate her because it's 1920. Just name any other authors that really tried to elevate their wife. So basically, that very tongue-in-cheek thing is that by equating her with him or saying that he quote plagiarized her, it brings her up to his level. And so people kind of use it backwards that he stole from her. Now, there is some of the early short stories she wrote, and her weakness, she would dash these stories off, but she would not edit them. So then, like, one of the
Mm,
big examples is one called Our Own Movie Queen. He edited it, made the surprise ending, and then it was published under his name. But he was getting the equivalent of $4,000 to $5,000 a story, and she would have gotten $250 to $500. And that's the
wow.
equivalent of like $50,000 a story a day. The reason we know what he wrote and what she wrote is he gave her credit in his ledger.
Interesting.
So that's the thing historians to say, well, we know she wrote these stories. Well, we know because he gave her credit. So they also, in the early days of magazine, of course, you had Cosmopolitan, Early Vogue. They were both writing in those. And then later in the marriage in the 1930s, when the marriage is kind of on very rocky ground, they considered divorcing. They returned from Europe. Zelda had been misdiagnosed in Europe. They came back to Montgomery. That's why this house is here. And then after Montgomery, they go to Baltimore. And while they're in Baltimore, they do consider a divorce. The reason we know this is there is an unpublished typescript, almost like like lawyers, court reporter.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in it, they kind of negotiate and they make this bargain, and that she had written her novel "Save Me the Waltz" and sent it to the publishers, and they accepted it without him knowing, and he was furious about it. And when you read his arguments, I can't say that he's wrong, but he turned the volume way up too high.
Um,
You're reading a married couple fighting, and the thing that's amazing about it is you think, my God, they talk this way. They talk that beautifully. His second,
oh,
because one
really?
of yeah, I mean it is a a transcription of this. One of her junior doctors came over. The secretary transcribed it, and it was literally sent to a legal transcription. So you're reading it, and it reads almost kind of like Virginia Woolf. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? So you see them very much in love, and then you see how they argue, and
Wow.
they start pushing buttons. But in that, they come to this agreement that she will write no more novels, but that he would get her short stories, a play, and an art exhibit, all of which he did immediately. So you can disagree. I think where I agree with him in principle is that he had the bigger name. They were both at their lowest financially, physically, probably emotionally as well. And he was struggling to get Tender as the Night Out. I think the reason that she submitted it behind his back is had that novel been successful, I think she would have divorced him. Because we forget today, women didn't even have the right to divorce till really with suffrage in 1920.
Yeah.
But when they did choose to divorce, they left with only the clothes on their back. So if you were to divorce your husband, you had to be financially independent. And so when her novel wasn't, I think it put them in this very tenuous situation. But that's why in the 30s you begin. So Zelda is the first woman, I believe, published by Esquire. We forget Esquire didn't publish women. And it showed Mr. and Mrs. F to room number, and she kind of catalogs all the hotels they had stayed in from when they were married until 1932 when it was published. It's very funny and cheeky. But it is this like wonderful travelogue, but it was published as Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. So his name is
Mm,
attached to it. But we know from newspaper clippings, they used to have these national columns that people would have and, the kind of gossip stuff. And, and it said that, well, we all know that Esquire doesn't publish women, but Zelda wrote this. So the nation knew that it was Zelda's. But if you're a historian and you don't know about that clipping, well, then you think Scott took it. So in the 30s, you see their names together because people weren't publishing women yet. So Is that too detailed?
No,
So you have this
it's
very
so
interesting,
interesting. It's
yeah,
fascinating. And I'm also wondering, and again, I don't know what I don't know. So I mean, if I'm way off base, you
yeah.
let me know.
No, there
But
are a lot of myths about Zelda.
it's an interesting balance almost. I don't know if that's the word I'm going for, but you have this very talented woman doing very impressive things during a time when women really couldn't, and she even struggled to do
Yeah.
them. And obviously had to lean on her husband for
Yeah.
a lot of that. Did she feel, I mean, is there a record of her then feeling resentful? Is that part of their conflict? Did she, despite having more success than perhaps many other women in her position, did she feel
I
angry
think
or
no,
want
I think
more?
they're different. They're different phases of their lives. In the early marriage, again, I think Fitzgerald scholar, when you read all the biographies, very few of them cover Montgomery. The most famous biography of Zelda is the Nancy Milford novel. But when Nancy Milford came here in the late 1960s, that novel came out 19, or I always call it a novel, it's biography, sorry. It's a very interesting work because it makes Zelda famous and it makes her this kind of feminist icon. But Milford hangs two weird myths onto Zelda. One, that she was schizophrenic. She was not.
Mm,
People really argue. We have Zelda's medical records. She was not schizophrenic. She was
interesting.
misdiagnosed in Switzerland, and that kind of puts her on a very bad trajectory. And two, even though Milford doesn't expressly state that Zelda began ballet at 27, Zelda tried to become a prima ballerina at 27. And so in Nancy Milford's obituary, the New York Times obituary has that Zelda had schizophrenia and that she tried to become a ballerina at 27. So it's kind of like you hear the Mandela effect, like it's the Berenstain Bears or whatever. So, so when you have the early marriage, um, they kind of work together very well. And then post Gatsby, there Zelda's alleged to have had an affair with a French airman. Scott writes Gatsby while they're in France. That French airman's family is still very protective of it, so we have to say alleged. Who knows? His family said they didn't, but you begin to see the marriage unravel after that.
Mm.
And then Zelda, you can see throughout their marriage from the stories. There's an early story called Head and Shoulders that Scott writes, and it's about a young academic who falls in love with a showgirl, and she's financially more successful than him because she's a big Broadway star. But you're assuming he went to Princeton. Princeton's outside New York, and so he's this academic writer, but she's making all the money. But then she becomes pregnant, so she's not the major breadwinner. But because he was athletic, he starts doing these like gymnastic shows or whatnot in the story.
Okay.
And so he now can't pursue his course of study or, he's like a philosopher. So while in the story, the showgirl writes a book that becomes incredibly popular. And at the end of the story, he's out doing these kind of gymnastic shows just to keep them afloat, but he can't follow his original pursuits. And the great philosopher that he loves comes to the house and he thinks that he's come to see him, but the philosophers come to see her because of her book. And I think it's this kind of it shows that his potential insecurity about her becoming maybe a writer that might eclipse him. And I think he seems to have. And then later you see in an article, he asks her if you were to have, he interviews her for a newspaper or a magazine article. And Scott asks Zelda, if you had to earn your own living, how would you do it? And she says, well, I've studied ballet. I could work in the Follies because, have the dancers, or I could write. And you just see the whole future trajectory is right there. And so in terms of Zelda and dance, there is no formal ballet company in the US till 1930s. So when people, they
Didn't
kind of,
realize it was so late. That's
yeah,
interesting.
American, so most ballet would either have been opera or the Follies.
Wow.
So when
Okay.
people talk about, well, she wasn't really ballet, she wanted to do the Follies. Well, you either did ballet in an opera company or the Follies. Zelda did dance, and now come a little all over the place. So, in terms of Zelda's life, there's an early writing career, then there's ballet, then there's post ballet, and then after Scott died, so they never divorce. They separate effectively in 36. She is at quote unquote Highland Hospital in Asheville, which in today's terminology would be very high end assisted living. In today's money, it would have been $8,000 to $10,000 a month.
Wow.
Yeah, and she was not confined. She came and went as she wanted. She painted. She would have lunch at the Grove Park End. People think it's an asylum because they hear the word hospital, but it was very nice. And he was out in California. But when he dies in 40, she'd actually already moved back to Montgomery and lived in part with her mother. And from 40 until her death in 48, she has 7 or 8 art shows. She travels on her own. She helped with the war effort because it's World War II. She did book reviews on Armed Forces Radio here. When one of their friends who was an author came to Montgomery, he was addressing the troops, she drove him out to address the Tuskegee Airmen. She
Hmm.
traveled on her own. She traveled to and from Asheville on her own. She wasn't, people, when they think she's in Asheville, she's only at the hospital. Her family summered in Asheville throughout her entire life. So most of the biographies end when he dies in 40. So her life is kind of in 3 phases. It's before, well, four. Before she meets Scott, there's early days, very romantic, very wild. Then the dancing kind of breakdown years, and then the post Scott years. Again, even though they were technically, they never divorced, the letters from the late 30s until his death in the 40s are also quite lovely because they had a very deep and enduring friendship, which is interesting. Even, most today, if you were to break up with someone or you're an ex, you wouldn't have these very encouraging, lovely letters back and forth.
No, no, no. You'd be deleting them off your social media.
Yeah. Or you could block them. Let's face it, you block them.
And what you're describing is so interesting to me. And I think that's, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, but for me, that is certainly where some of the almost confusion lies with their relationship because on the surface, it is one of the most romantic things you could experience is to read some of these letters and to learn about, bits and pieces of their love story. But it's also so nuanced. I'm almost wondering if we go back because there's so much to dissect in within all of
Sure.
this. But if we go back a second, I mean, they were, and I haven't seen, of course, the documentation of some of these, gossip columns, for lack of maybe a better word.
Yeah.
But especially as a historian, I'm sure you've seen some of these firsthand. You've read some of these articles. So my understanding is that they were essentially touted as sort of this super famous jazz age couple. You are comparing them to some modern day celebrity couples. So were these gossip columns focused on just them being two very successful people? Were they starting to clue into the complexities of their relationship? Were they kind of glorified? I mean, what did that look like to the public? Was the public onto all of this?
So one of the famous photos of them, they're together, and Zelda has some kind of fur, probably mink coat on. And then there's another one that appeared in Cosmopolitan. So, and she has this wavy hair. She calls it her Elizabeth Arden hair. So they're getting like a full page spread in
Wow.
Cosmopolitan was not like today. I mean, it was in vogue. These were higher end publications, higher society. When you talk about the gossip columns, they are appearing in that, but they're actually writing advice columns. There's some funny advice, so they're actually doing guest columns, but she's doing guest columns. So
Okay.
the thing that's unusual is not unusual that he's being asked to do them. What's unusual is she's being asked to do them. So there's a variety of these columns that they're both writing. The museum is putting out an illustrated The Great Gatsby, and in the back of it is one of these. It's kind of like a Facebook feed. Like when anyone went to Europe, they put it is in the society section, or if anyone had tea with each other, it was in that society section. But it's very interesting that there was this one of these little stories talking about how the Fitzgeralds had decided to leave New York City and go to Europe, where he would be writing his next novel. But it's all about how Zelda's, and it's her photos in the blurb, not his. And it'll be in
Interesting.
the back of our. It's coming out. Well, it should be out when this airs, I think. But the museum's version of The Great Gatsby, and it's illustrated, but we have a lot of these newspaper clippings in the back about the history around it. But what did strike me is that Zelda's face, it's Zelda's point of view on it. So they were these two big media stars, and when you look at them, I think Scott, they were really the type of beauty for that time period. He was very handsome. They were both very blonde, very blue-eyed. I don't know that Zelda's looks are today's contemporary looks, but Scott's definitely are. And so they were really kind of a standard of beauty. The other thing that I don't think translates or you don't notice it immediately is that they were always dressed very sporty. Part of being a flapper was being sporty. We think you're wearing a flapper dress, you're very girly. But flappers at that time, part of their independence, they were glamorous and they had the dresses, but they also golfed and they also swam. In the article where they're asking Zelda about it, there's this artwork and it has the four styles of woman. She's in that almost like a kimono. It has a big fur collar on it. The next is the very sexy one piece bathing suit. So remember they had those weird dresses with
Yeah.
pantaloons, and then they had that really kind of one piece shorts. Well, it's that with high heels, which is a very sexy bathing suit for them. And then the golf, because if you think Jordan and Gatsby, she's an independent. She's on this amateur golf. They weren't pro golfers yet, but she's this independent woman that's off doing what she wanted. So that was part of the flapper as well. And Scott coined Zelda the first flapper. So when Scott and Zelda showed up, they were in what we would call athleisure today. When you see him in the jacket, the Norfolk jacket, the plus fours, and the saddle shoes, that was that time period's version of, the tracksuit, the athletic clothes, where everyone else are in suits and ties. And
Mm.
then Zelda's in that kind of jersey knit, the low waisted. We forget Chanel was an athlete. Coco Chanel began in what in today's terminology would be athleisure. She used jersey knit. It was for women. She got rid of the corset. Women could move, women could play golf. But the first athletic brand for women was Chanel. It's now high
Wow.
fashion. So when you saw Scott and Zelda show up, one of the biographers, Andrew Turnbull, knew Scott as a child, and he said Scott always resembled a college athlete home on the weekend. So they were both very beautiful, but they were both extremely athletic. Zelda and Montgomery could outswim most of the boys in her class. So
Wow.
at that time, I don't know if she would have been an Olympic swimmer, not today, but then she was very athletic as well. A very strong swimmer. She's the only girl that would go off the high dive. I think that's kind of lost too, is that they were both extremely athletic. But it
That's
was a
so
new
interesting.
ideal for women to be athletic in the 20s. So in the 30s, in this transcript, and again, it's not been published, only little excerpts have been published. But I went to Princeton, and it's a thing, and you sit there and you read a photocopy of it. She writes her not in her novel. He says, "You made me and Save Me the Waltz." They're clearly very semi-autobiographical. And he says, "You've made me," he said, "I made you a star, and you've made me look like," I'm paraphrasing, like a fool or something. And he goes, "We were the most famous people in 1920." And that's not an exaggeration. And she says, "We were awfully good showmen."
Wow.
Yeah. And you think that
Wow.
was the trajectory of that. Like they really were. And then I think. There's a lady that I do research on. Her name's Mara Martello, and she wrote the book on the Zelda on the Fitzgeralds here in Montgomery. And we do a lot of local research on Zelda because not there are big gaps in Zelda research. And the thing that she always likes to point out is that people kind of remember the Fitzgeralds for that slice of the 20s. Like, do you want to be remembered for your college years? But that Zelda, like all
Definitely
women,
not.
grew older. She wasn't always this party girl, that she matured. She wanted a home. She was a mother. In the early years, she didn't cook or clean, but in her later life, she became quite an avid and very good cook and gardener and, music and whatnot. And so the I think people only look at the Fitzgeralds or often look at the Fitzgeralds in this very narrow time period where you have to look at that they're people who lived a life.
You touched on the flapper thing, which
Mhm.
I would love to hear a little bit more about because I personally have a very limited, just what's shown to me on television
Mhm.
understanding of all of that. And I do know that he kind of coined her as the first. So, I mean, what is that? What was happening
So
there?
originally the term flapper comes from the UK and gets assumed into American English. We don't really have the term teenager until post World War II. So originally a flapper was an unmarried young woman. And then when
Oh
she
my gosh.
marries, she ceases to be a flapper. But then the way we look at it today is just kind of anyone that's kind of got those clothes on and is wild and dancing. So the flapper in America kind of becomes this young, because women aren't really going to college yet either. We don't see women entering colleges to maybe 40s or 50s, in mass. Most like when Scott's at Princeton, it's still men only. Some of Zelda's friends in Montgomery go on to college at Goucher, which is in Baltimore. Most famously, I know it gives context to Zelda. There are four. Zelda grew up with three other girls. One is Tallulah Bankhead, the actress. I don't know if she's well known, but she's a very prominent actress. Sarah Mayfield and Sarah Hart. Sarah Hart went to Goucher first. So I have to explain, Zelda's father was on the original school board, and Zelda and her siblings went to public school. But across the street from the public school was a private school, Margaret Booth School. Tallulah, Sarah Hart, and Sarah Mayfield all went to this private girls' school. And then Sarah Hart went to Goucher, and she later becomes H.L. Mencken's wife. Sarah Mayfield followed her there, but all writers. Sarah Mayfield won a writing competition, and the prize was to meet H.L. Mencken, and she took Sarah Hart with her, and that's how Mencken and Hart meet. Prominent American writer, editor. I don't know, he's not as well known today, but Zelda's close childhood friends weren't, as young women, like Sarah Mayfield went on, she divorced her husband, which was unusual, had a huge society marriage here, divorced him, went and studied at the Sorbonne in Paris, came back, was a writer here in the US, was also what we would now today call an ethnomusicologist. She would drive around and record jazz artists. This is kind of wild for a woman
It
in
is really
yeah.
fascinating.
And so when her father died, Zelda's father and Mayfield's fathers were both state Supreme Court judges. That's all four of these little girls' parents were in the state capitol building, and that's how they all knew each other. Tallulah Bankhead's aunt was the first woman to hold a cabinet level position in Alabama. So Zelda, when we talk about being a flapper, I think today we think of it being very girly, you're dancing, woo, right. But for then, it was coming before and then immediately after suffrage. It connotated being independent. It connotated being physically strong and athletic, which women hadn't been, because that's the whole thing. Like the reason you do the Charleston is you have a corset on. You can't move like you're
Your
moving
upper
your hands
body.
and knees. Yeah,
Yeah.
just imagine you've got this corset that goes to your hips. Well, that's why you're doing the Charleston. You see why that motion happens because the 20s dress they're trying to flatten you out, make you into, do you know what I mean?
Right.
And so there were still some restrictions, but so Zelda was part of this extraordinary group of young women from Alabama. And you have Tallulah was a very prominent actress both in New York and London, later a film star, very eccentric. Sarah Hartman dies young, but very prominent authors. And then Sarah Mayfield, that's what I'm going back to. When her father died was a judge, her brother had her involuntary committed to Bryce, which is an asylum in
Oh my
Tuscaloosa,
gosh.
Alabama. So the way she survived it is she documented it from the inside like a journalist.
Oh my gosh.
And then they were going to so when her father dies, they were just going to quietly let her out. And she says, "No, I will not leave until I'm given a full bill of health and her full legal rights," which took like another 2, 3 years. And we've interviewed a couple people in Tuscaloosa that knew her, and she just kind of used it as a apartment. And she would go over to the library and do research. And then when she was eventually let out, she had her full legal rights, which meant she had her full inheritance, which meant she could live independently.
Wow.
I don't know how many of us would stay in an asylum for an additional how many years to fight it and go, no, this is wrong. And then she worked at the University of Alabama and she wrote the biography of H.L. Mencken. And then she wrote the biography of Zelda that we recommend. It's called Exiles from Paradise with Scott and Zelda. I think, it's that kind. Fitzgerald scholars will say it's the Alabama point of view. They don't like it because Mayfield does not like Scott.
Okay.
She does not like him. And you read it and it makes me laugh. But when it was published shortly after the very famous Mayfield, and her publishers took out her footnotes. And so we are currently working on having it reprinted with all of her research because her research is amazing. Because she interviewed probably 20 plus of their childhood friends. Like everything, like she'll say one Montgomery and says, no, no one wants to be quoted.
Yeah.
But when you see the archives and you see the letters, and she sent all these surveys to people out in Hollywood that all knew them, she has amazing research, but there's no footnotes. So that one's called Exiles from Paradise. And we're currently working to try to have that republished with her original footnotes.
Oh, how interesting.
These women are extraordinary women, but you've probably never heard of any of them.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that you've mentioned their names because now
Yeah.
I'm going to go down a rabbit hole, which is
Mhm.
my favorite after these conversations. But you've you've touched on a few things and I want to make sure we address some of them. So
Okay.
one of those things is, you're talking about archives. I know that you have the museum.
Mhm.
I would be curious, kind of going back to those love letters.
Mhm.
As a historian, how do those inform history or inform their dynamics for you? Or what does that tell you as a historian outside of what perhaps the layperson is, reading them and just kind of gushing over the beauty of it all? Are there things that you've gleaned over the years and kind of dissected?
You read them for pleasure. You read anything. And then if you're a historian, there's very interesting details. For example, it's not those letters, but I can tell you, for example, some of Zelda's letters have not been published. They're called the Biggs letters. So after Scott dies in 40, and then until her death in 48, Scott named one of his Princeton classmates, John Biggs, who was just below a U.S. Supreme Court judge. He was very high, named him as the executor of his will. And Zelda would write him about once or twice a month, kind of as unspoken, sometimes a reminder, hey, I need my check, right?
Yeah.
Because he left an annuity. So Zelda was not Zelda in today, I think her annual annuity would be about equivalent of $50,000 today. She died with
Wow.
stock. Now, if you're making 250,000 and you drop down to 50, it's a drop. There's those kind of details, but in them, she would write at the top of the letters where she was, like when she was writing to him. And that's how I found out that she's in Asheville. And then you read the address, and you realize, and you Google the address, see if it's still there, and you realize, wait, she's staying with Thomas Wolfe's mom, the famous boarding house from Look Homeward Angel. And then we're like, wait, these letters are written from Thomas Wolfe's mother's home. And then you realize, wait, she's not in the hospital. She's not confined. She's staying with Thomas Wolfe's mom. And then you realize, wait, she's not confined to this hospital. She's traveling on her own. She's clearly competent. And then she jokes about how she sees people that she had known there. And then you realize, wait, like there's just not all of them. I don't want to blanket everyone, but there are certain biographers of Zelda. They just go, well, Scott died. She's in this hospital. And it is a hospital, but when you look at the original ads, and you're like, well, what was this hospital? And then you realize it says for minor nervous cases. And then you read the description, you're like, this is like assisted living or retirement living. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like she's, and
Yeah.
then you go, like you say, you go down the rabbit hole, and then you're like, wait, she's getting breakfast in bed, massage in bed, hydrotherapy, which is like hot tub. She's painting, she's dancing, and you just think, yeah, this is not an asylum.
It's like a
Do you know what I
wellness
mean?
retreat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what it originally was. And so I think during that time period, to be divorced was very scandalous. It was very scandalous to be divorced in the 1980s. My parents divorced. I can just tell you what my mother suffered. So you think in the 30s it was really bad. So with her, I think it was an out for them both because she was there. It was quote a hospital. And so they could be separate without being divorced. And I think
Hmm.
people think that he stuck her in this asylum. They always talk about Fitzgerald had money problems, but he's paying in today's money $8,000 to $10,000 for her to be very comfortable in Asheville. And Asheville was a second home for she and her family. I was there last year in March for Zelda Days, and we went to some of the little towns that we know that her parents, again from these letters you haven't heard of, that they stayed there. And this one is, oh yeah, we've hosted four generation of Sayers. I haven't seen this in a single Fitzgerald biography.
Oh my
And
gosh.
they start telling you all about the Sayre family and whatnot. And so when you talk about in the letters, you get these small details which then take you down this rabbit hole. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Or sometimes they just mention other people, or you begin to confirm small details. But like just like avid readers, you read it for the pleasure and the enjoyment, but as a historian, you start looking, and sometimes now they wrote in that time period with the type of pen that you dip in ink, and they're really hard to read. And then also they're not always dated properly. So I have to say, I think there's a couple letters that I think only because I have the newspaper clippings from Alabama that I think a couple of when they're dating, there's a few that are maybe turned around in terms of date. But the Dear Scott, Dearest Zelda editing is really good because you look at that handwriting and you think, wow, it's very difficult to read.
I don't want to forget to ask because, of course, you are in a museum.
Mhm.
Is it a historic house museum? And if so, I mean, so what are some of do you have any favorite artifacts or pieces in the home or things that were particularly special to them?
Most historic homes, like Faulkner's Rowan Oak, he had willed it, and when he died, everything's as that day. The Fitzgeralds never owned a home and they never stayed anywhere more than a year, often only 6 months at a time. So they wintered here from 31 to 32. So we don't have the original furniture for this house. So, and then when they were the last to live in the entire house. The house is about 6,500 square feet. It's a big house. But when they moved out, the house, the man that owned it had remarried. He was a widower. They split the house because it's the height of the Depression. They split the house into four apartments. And so it was apartments from, they split it in 30, the Fitzgeralds moved out 32, 33, they split it. It's open in 34. And then the house was saved in 1989. And the Fitzgerald's daughter, Scotty Fitzgerald, She went on to be a journalist. She had a national column with the Washington Post. She was a major Democratic fundraiser in D.C. Her husband was a very prominent D.C. lawyer, but she had gone to Vassar and was close friends with one of President LBJ's daughters. She was very high DC society. But when she and her husband divorced in the late 1960s, she returned and lived here in Montgomery until her death in 1986. And many people will tell you there's a lady in her 90s that is still living. We have what's known as I'd like to just digress slightly, what's known as the Press and Authors Club. It was founded in 1914. Zelda's mother and sisters were two of the inaugural members, and it's for professional women writers. It still meets here. It meets here at the museum. Zelda was a member of the club in 1940, and then one of Scotty's friends just did a presentation on Scotty, and she's 96. So
Wow.
this club is now what will be 111 years old, but it's kind of the legacy that's still here. So Scotty moved here and lived here because this was the one place she wasn't a Fitzgerald. It's very much Zelda's hometown. And Scotty did a lot in the historic neighborhood, and she bought and saved a house across from this house. And then she passed away in 86, and then this house went on the market in 87. And the same developers wanted to buy it and tear it down. And it's really out of a love of Scotty, not just Scott and Zelda, but Scotty did a lot for women's rights here in Alabama. It was part of the ERA era, the 70s and early 80s. And so this house was bought and saved by a civil rights lawyer who was also a Princetonian. He and his wife bought, saved the house, and then in 89, they made it to the museum. So they had ties to Princeton. In terms of artifacts, the furniture, a lot of the furniture we have on the ground floor is from Zelda's childhood home, the Pleasant Avenue home. In the 1970s, when they were putting all the interstates through, um, they tore down Zelda's original childhood home. Scotty tried to save it, couldn't, got the salvage rights. And so that's how we have a lot of the parts of that house. Also, Zelda's niece, Sarah Noble Godwin, was on the founding board of this museum, and she donated a fair amount of Sarah family artifacts. Also, when Scotty Fitzgerald knew she was dying, she would have these parties where she would have friends over and said, just take whatever. And
Oh,
look, yeah, Zelda was very famous still. So a lot of people took, things from, Zelda's things, and they've given them to us. So I don't know if you can see back here, we have one of Zelda's dresses,
yeah.
possibly one of her jackets. Those came from Scotty. It's not out at the moment. We have two of Scott's jackets given to us by the family. We do have each of the first editions. People like the first editions. We have quite a number of books that Scott and Zelda gave and signed to her parents. We have we have Scott's Princeton yearbooks, his certificate. We have some of the original programs when he was in the Triangle Club. We have the largest permanent collection of Zelda's artworks. We have 12 of her original artworks on permanent display. And I'm trying to think. For me, in terms of Zelda, we have the copy of Save Me the Waltz that she wrote and inscribed to her sister Rosalind, because the whole
Um,
first chapter is about her sister. Quite a number of Zelda's personal items. We have one of Scott's writing pens along with Gatsby. And we also, people love this, but we have two of the costumes on loan from the DiCaprio film. We have the pink suit and the tuxedo.
oh,
So
how fun.
yeah, so we have a lot of their personal items, a lot of books, but for me, sometimes the Zelda's paintings and art are really important. I find it interesting that we have their clothes. One of the things that always surprises me is people like they didn't live there a full year. That's not very long. But you think, how long does it take to sign? They always want to see the signature in the book. Well, that takes what, 20 seconds, 30 seconds? But they lived here. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
The other thing is because the house was split into four apartments, the museum is on the ground floor, and you can come stay with us in the house. There are two full apartments upstairs, the Scott Suite. When they lived here in the house, we know from their letters, here's another detail. We know they kept separate bedrooms throughout their marriage. Very common, particularly if you could afford it. They could. And so the Scott Suite, based on their letters from they were here in the house, we believe that he was on one side, she was on the other. So you can come stay with us, the Scott Suite or the Zelda Suite.
That's
And
great.
those suites have furniture from Zelda's friends. So some of the furniture, like the living room furniture in the Zelda suite, were from Zelda's friend the Castles, who lived just down the street from when they were here. And then the Scott suite has some of the furniture from another of Zelda's friends. So we have furniture from four different houses that we know they visited while living in this house. So they sat on this furniture, but not in this house.
Why do you think this continues to captivate folks? I mean, them, their work, their love story. Why do you think all this time later it's still relevant and people are still captivated?
Part of me, I don't know the answer, and part of me, I think I do. This is the 100th anniversary. April in a few months is the 100th anniversary of Gatsby, and Gatsby still is literally read internationally everywhere. It's considered a great American novel. The museum's just putting out our edition, so we had to literally read it letter for letter, comment by comment, to make sure it matched the. We have a first edition because copyright. And you read it, and it's beautiful, and it's sad, and it's enduring. And I was really trying to think. I don't know, because I don't like tragedies. I know it sounds strange, but if you think one of the most successful musicals in the modern era is Phantom of the Opera, you have that sense of haunting. So I think Gatsby, in some way, embodies that. And how many people read it in high school? We just had this group of Germans come through and they had all read it in high school in Germany. It's what they had to read for their English class. But then on the other side, Zelda is extremely popular in China, in France, and in South America. I'm not entirely
Really?
sure.
I would
Oh, yeah.
never have known
Yeah,
that.
in Belgium, we're huge in Belgium. France, we get a lot of Chinese women come to the museum for Zelda. French women, Zelda. For Zelda, it's different things. Some are very drawn to her because she's obviously free-spirited. Some are very interested in her because she was a ballerina. Some are very interested. I just got a European scholar wants to come because of her art. And then the mental health question. Basically, she was misdiagnosed with schizophrenia and then treated with what was known as insulin shock therapy, which is a hypoglycemic coma. They induce, yeah. It was very, and people say they did it too because she was a woman. Not true. It was a very wealthy treatment, but very destructive. And the fact that she was enduring that and has this massive creative output at the end of her life, which you don't hear much about, particularly her painting, I just don't know. I think Zelda, a strength, it's kind of a truism, but a strength over relied upon becomes a weakness. Zelda was a very competent writer. She came very close to being a prima ballerina. And my specialty is history and art history. Her paintings are highly underrated. There's a painting in talking about the letters again. She wrote a letter to Scott saying, she had gone to an exhibit and there was a Picasso and it was terrible. And the one she's talking about is terrible. It's of a chair, it's terrible. And she says, I think the only good ones are the one Gertrude Stein has. And I was like, well, which ones did Stein have? So that takes you in a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Like which paintings? And then you think there's a painting that she has of Acrobat, which I think is somewhat, when you think of Picasso's pink and blue period, it's right there with them. I mean, her style, and you put them together, and you're like, wow. Now, you may not like Picasso's pink and blue period. Go look at it. But if you think that's genius, then you have to acknowledge that hers is comparable. She's not copying him. But also, she didn't have a postcard of it. Couldn't go on Google Images and look at it. Like, hopefully,
Exactly.
people will go look. And it's a painting that's here at the Montgomery Museum of Fine Arts. It's one that I saw, as a kid when they take you for your field trip. So that was my introduction to Zelda was her paintings, and they're stunning and they're beautiful. And the other introduction I had to Zelda was, I think I was probably second gradish, And we were at the grocery store walking out with my mother, and this two college students walk up to my mom, a couple, and the guy says, "Do you know who Zelda is?" And my mom said, "Everyone knows who Zelda is." And he goes, "What is she known for?" And my mom says, "Swimming in the fountain." And the guy turned to the girl and said, "See, like everyone knows Zelda." I'm like, who is this woman? I was the second grade. So when you're from Montgomery, Zelda isn't a historic person. She's someone like they tell stories about your grandmother or your great grandmother. Scott, in some ways, is a historic figure. I learned about him in school like everyone else. But Zelda, everyone I know, my mom's age and older, has a story. My grandmother grew up in the neighborhood. Zelda's church was Church of the Holy Comforter, and my grandmother grew up, her family house was next door to it,
Okay.
and lived in the same neighborhood. Zelda's mother lived until 1958.
Oh my gosh.
And
Did she
yeah,
really?
so yeah, she lived till
Wow.
58. And so, yeah, when you look through the voting rolls, you see Zelda, Rosa Parks. Just once a slight digression. So when Zelda returns to Montgomery in 1940, and if you come to Montgomery, there's a place called Chris's Hot Dogs. It's been there since 1916. It's just down from the Capitol. They're a Greek family. It's still owned by the same Greek family, and they had the first counter service for African Americans. And so MLK would walk down from the Capitol, eat at Chris's hot dogs. So beginning in 40 until Zelda's death in 1948, you had Zelda, Rosa Parks, and Hank Williams in Montgomery for 7.5 years together. And
Wow.
they all would have been at Chris's hot dogs because young Hank Williams had the corners. Zelda's dance studio was above it, and Rosa Parks worked across the street, and that's the one place she could have had counter service.
Wow.
So you don't think of those three names
No.
together, but if you come to Montgomery, we had all three of those, and it's still there today, Chris's Hot Dogs.
One of the last things I want to make sure we talk
Sure.
about is that you mentioned there is a very exciting 100th anniversary coming up. Before we hit record, we were kind of talking about some of the exciting things surrounding that. So I want to make sure folks hear about that from you and that you can,
Yeah, so
yeah,
we
let them know
have
what to look for.
so April 10th is the 100th anniversary of the publication of Great Gatsby. Hopefully by the time this airs, the museum's version will be out on Amazon. We've done an illustrated teaching edition, and it also has the history. Almost every character in Gatsby was based on someone. A lot of people don't know that. We found Dan, Cody, and Myrtle were most likely named after two of Zelda's friends, and so we have their images, Ginevra King, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see all those people. But also on April 12th, we are throwing a big Gatsby party here at the museum. We'll have a 10-piece jazz band, food, booze, Literati Spirits. If people don't know them, they have a new Gatsby and Daisy vodka. They're really good. And so we're having a big party. And so you can go to our website if you want to, celebrate with us. We'll be here in April, big party. So just go to our website if I can throw that out. It's thefitzgeraldmuseum.org.
I will make sure to throw your website in the show notes. We'll make sure to
Mhm.
direct people to, information on ticketing for that, as
Yeah.
well as links, of course, the book that you are currently working on getting out
Mhm.
for the anniversary, but also some of the other books that you've mentioned throughout our
Mhm.
conversation. I'll make sure
Yeah.
to link to those for people.
We do have two podcasts. One is you go to the Fitz Muse, Fitz for Fitzgerald, Muse for Museum. And for the past few years, we have had actors read Scott's short stories, kind of like radio plays. A few were single voice, but a lot of them were multi voice. And we put a few out each fall for his birthday. And the others, we do have a Zelda podcast. It's called Zelda's Peaches and Biscuits. So if you're interested in more of Zelda and her mom and whatnot, we haven't really gotten to where she meets Scott yet. It's the early Montgomery years.
Oh, that's so fun. I'll link those too. I'll,
Okay.
I'll grab those so folks can listen. But this has been, we covered a lot, and I know
Yeah.
my questions were ping-ponging all over, but I
Yeah.
do think there is just so much. So I hope that this did give folks, I know I feel slightly more informed than when I came in because I had a very limited understanding
Yeah.
of who they were as individuals and as a couple. So I do appreciate you taking the time today as
Oh,
well.
I appreciate it.